As he approaches the Brandenburg Gate, he is stopped and asked to what extent he has contributed to the victory. He shakes his head, a look of bewilderment on his face, before responding, "Nix ponemayu." The single survivor from the decimated infantry regiments during the long years on the Eastern Front, he has forgotten the German language. Whenever the old Gefreiters were wounded, or more seldom disabled due to sickness, they would go to great lengths to avoid being sent to a replacement company or reassigned to another unit being newly formed. Through experience, they had learned that they were more likely to survive with their old unit, where everyone knew one another and knew those on whom they must depend with their lives. Individual units were composed of officers and NCOs who had suffered deprivations and had experienced fear together for years on the front, and to be separated from these familiar surroundings and faces could be traumatic. With each loss of a battle-experienced member, the gap could often be filled only with personnel from supply, staff, or Luftwaffe units with little or no infantry combat experience. As the numbers of the old veteran Gefreiters declined, the casualties among the new men would rise accordingly. On one occasion, we received a group of replacements shortly after being relieved on the line. A Feldwebel escorted them to their new company, and as was customary, I spoke with the new members, asking each individual his name, formal occupation, background, and so on. Among them were 4 soldiers from Alsace, and one of the short, stout Gefreiters looked vaguely familiar to me. It suddenly occurred to me that he had been the kitchen bull at the replacement centre, where I had received basic training as a recruit. I asked him if he had ever served with the Panzerjägerersatz-Kompanie in Darmstadt, and he replied with a hearty, "Jawohl, Herr Leutnant." I then requested that he report to me later at the company headquarters. He appeared as ordered, completely outfitted with correct battle dress, including a gas mask and helmet. I initially put him at ease with light conversation, and then I revealed to him that I had been a recruit under his direction in the past. He immediately sprang to attention with a look of distress on his face as I related numerous incidents of harassment and verbal abuse that my friends and I had endured under his tutelage. I specifically mentioned one interesting incident during which he had discovered 2 tiny encrusted drops of coffee in the massive aluminum coffee canister I was engaged in cleaning. Afterward, I was berated, insulted, and duly informed of the importance of cleanliness for the welfare of the army. I was then compelled to spend the remainder of the afternoon cleaning the kitchen equipment until each item met his satisfaction. To his immense relief, I then slapped him on the shoulder and remarked about the incredible trials one must endure to become a soldier. He proved to be a brave and very reliable member of the company. On the 22nd of July, the Russians attacked the Sappenkopf with overwhelming strength, and we were thrown into battle as regimental reserves to close a local breakthrough. During the course of the heavy fighting, a 20-year-old Alsatian received a severe wound, from which he subsequently died while being transported toward the regimental aid station. That evening, his platoon Feldwebel gathered together the soldiers' effects. It was customary to separate those items to be sent to the relatives from those things that would not be appropriate for the family. During the course of these unpleasant duties, the Feldwebel approached me and requested to speak in confidence. He then revealed to me a letter written by the fallen soldier's mother. "Our dear son, you have now been sent to distant Russia as a German soldier. There will come a time for us in France when the sun shall shine again. We have heard that the Russians treat the Alsatians very well. The neighbour has told me that she wrote to her husband imploring him to surrender to the Russians. Throw away your rifle and go to the Russians. Surely they will treat you well." Other things followed, the common things that are written by distraught mothers to sons at war far from home. Leaving the letter in my care, the Feldwebel wordlessly departed. It was my duty to pass the letter to higher command. I failed to do so, although it was quite obvious that the writer neither trusted in nor desired a final victory for Germany. It was quite clear as well that the soldier's mother was willing to risk even her own life in an attempt to save her son from the fate that was befalling so many on the Eastern Front. I made a conscious decision not to bring additional hardship on the soldier's family. The fact that a grieving mother in Alsace did not support Germany's military endeavours or our political system would certainly have had no bearing on determining our victory or defeat in this world at war. In losing her son, she had already suffered more than a mother should have to bear. On the 28th of August 1943, I celebrated my 23rd birthday on the operating table in the Field Medical Centre. I had recently been struck in the upper left arm by shrapnel from a shell fired by a Russian artillery battery south of Lake Ladoga. Despite cursory medical treatment, the wound had become infected, and it was suspected that fragments of my uniform had been carried into the wound by the jagged steel. After examining the wound, the regimental surgeon, Dr. Hager, ordered an operation for which he used anesthesia that supposedly put the patient into a trance, during which all questions asked would be truthfully answered. As I regained consciousness, I became aware that a large number of friends from the regiment, Fritz Schmidt, Bouquet, Deuschel, Rech, and others, were gathered about to witness the effectiveness of the truth serum. Under the encouragement of Dr. Hager, they were very convincing when telling me of incredible things heard while I was under the influence of the medication. Not surprisingly, most of the questions asked were concerning certain experiences with females. In order to hinder the usual after-effects of the anesthesia, such as nausea and vomiting, a bottle of Kirschwasser was provided, with the understanding that it must be shared by all those present. The evening of drinking and song was broken only by the new jokes and rumours that now abounded, at my expense, concerning my supposed social life as revealed during the operation. Despite suffering subsequent pain and a fever from the wound, I remained among the troops until receiving orders for a furlough several days later. I soon departed for the homeland, accompanied by Dr. Hager and Hauptmann Dedel. At the end of our furlough, we met as planned in Lyuban, where we climbed aboard the train that carried us back to our regiment deep in Soviet Russia. Those units of the 132 Days Infantry Division that were relieved to the west and south of Poritchai were then sent into the Drachchevo area to assume operations in the sector previously held by the 81st Infantry Division at the Volchov and Kirishi bridgehead. With the exception of occasional clashes between reconnaissance patrols from both sides, as well as isolated skirmishes along the perimeter of the bridgehead, the area assumed by the division on the 20th of August remained quiet. On the 27th of August, Oberst Altmann, commander of Grenadier Regiment 438, was killed while inspecting the forward lines of the Kirishi bridgehead. Without warning, an order was issued on the 11th of September to plan for the pending evacuation of the bridgehead by the 81st, the 132 days, and units of the 96th Divisions. The positions in the area of Kosinka and south of Myagray were to be abandoned as well. On the 14th of September, preparations for the evacuation began. All excess material not immediately required for the fighting units was either transported or destroyed, including reserve ordnance and fuel. The transportation of the material was carried out over a period of 5 days, and upon completion of the final phases, all assets deemed of value to the enemy, such as bridges, roads, railways, dwellings, and wells, were prepared for destruction by the pioneer units. The sky filled with heavy black smoke, as all supplies and equipment not removed were systematically destroyed by the Lancer as they prepared to withdraw. The evacuation and withdrawal plan for the combat units required 5 days to complete. For the purpose of hindering any follow-up action by the enemy, certain features were designated as strongpoints that were to be abandoned only during the last phase of the operation. Included in the strongpoints were areas within the Kirishi bridgehead and important railroad positions. The evacuation order was set into motion during the night of 1 to the 2nd of October, with the withdrawal of the 2nd Company, Grenadier Regiment 437, which had been designated the Bridgehead Reserve. Only one railway was available for the movement of an entire division, which now consisted primarily of horse-drawn artillery and dismounted infantry. However, the evacuation was flawlessly executed without interruption from enemy forces, and with no losses in men and material. During the interim, the main line was held for another 24 hours, until the Lancer quietly abandoned their thinly held positions at midnight. Soon after the last platoons had initiated their march out of the pocket, the enemy began cautiously probing the empty German positions with reconnaissance patrols and light infantry units. No large-scale enemy movement was detected, however, until the afternoon of the 5th of October, when enemy-tracked vehicles piled high with infantry were observed moving into the area of Irsa Dubrovo, and they were quickly taken under artillery fire. After the last battle-weary Lancer crossed the Volchov during the night of 3 October, preset demolition charges were detonated, completely destroying the railroad bridge and rendering it unusable to the enemy. By midnight on the 5th of October, the division was occupying new positions at Kusinka and had completed defensive preparations. With the withdrawal of the last rear guard from Grenadier Regiment 437 and Fusilier Battalion 132 on the morning of the 6th of October, Operation Hubertusjagd came to an end. We received more propaganda leaflets from the Red Army that month. For the soldiers of the 7th Company, Infantry Regiment 437, 132 Infantry Division, Hitler has led you into a catastrophe. In attempts to conceal this fact, your High Command speaks of a flexible defence and a shortening of the front line. The Hitler clique has, in the course of 2 years on the Eastern Front, waged a war that has murdered millions of young Germans and made widows and orphans of millions more, only to gain a so-called shortening of the front line. You yourselves can judge the gains of the flexible defence, as the Red Army has already thrown the Germans behind the banks of the Dnieper, occupied the city of Zaporozhye, cut off the Crimea, and is now successfully fighting in the suburbs of Kiev and Gomel. The German army is bleeding to death on the Eastern Front. The 26 soldiers of the 1st Company of your regiment, who together with their company commander, Oberleutnant Rudolf Kramer, gave themselves up to the Russians on the 12th of March 1943, can show you the path of survival. For them, the horrors of war are over. After the war, they will return to their homeland healthy and sound. Whether you return to your families or are destroyed as fascist invaders upon Russian soil depends entirely upon the decision you make. Decide before it's too late. Often, the Russian propaganda units used crude photo montages, assembled from pictures and names taken from identity documents that had been confiscated from German prisoners or collected from the dead. In our sector, as well as on all other fronts, Soviet aircraft dropped tons of such leaflets over our lines. The soldiers enthusiastically collected them and put the leaflets to good use in the latrines, as paper for this purpose was always in short supply. The communications unit of the division retained a special reconnaissance and interception platoon. This unit would dispatch specially trained teams behind enemy lines to tap into the landline networks. Thus, the telephone communications of the enemy could often be intercepted and overheard. In this manner we could hear the messages of the Russian officers, and through their often coarse language we learned that women were playing an ever-increasing role on the enemy staff as communications technicians or logistics officers. We intercepted Russian propaganda as well. In one instance we intercepted the orders of the day issued to a rifle company opposite our position. This order detailed the plan and timeline for capturing the strategically important railroad crossing at Kirishi and the largest wooden match factory of the Soviet Union. Later interceptions announced in great detail the assault on Kirishi against a strongly fortified enemy and its subsequent capture by brave Soviet soldiers. In reality, Kirishi had been systematically evacuated by our forces prior to the execution date of this order. On another occasion, we overheard a regimental commander berating a junior officer for failing to capture booty during an operation. "How can I capture anything?" the exasperated officer responded, "when the Fritzes take every Scheissdreck with them." The word Scheissdreck was spoken in German. One night, our main battle position was penetrated by approximately 50 Soviet soldiers. Using great skill and stealth, they successfully climbed through the fortifications in an area thinly guarded by sentries, without a shot being fired. After discovering the infiltrators within our lines, the soldiers manning the 2 machine guns on the right and left flanks of the area of penetration took the enemy under fire. Several of the Soviets fell dead or wounded, while the remainder scrambled through the darkness to escape. During the encounter, not a shot was returned, and at dawn we discovered by examining the bodies of the Russians struck by the machine gun fire that no firearms were among them. Still clenched in their cold fists were opened razors, with which they had planned to silently cut the throats of our sentries. On the 4th of December, we were on the offensive again. With the assault reserve of the regiment, I arrived at the small stream where it cut through a triangular wooded area. To our left, Schmidt's battalion was engaged in heavy fighting, and opposite us, tanks were moving into position. I ordered absolute noise discipline along our sector, and that only clearly recognizable infantry targets be fired upon when necessary. I immediately requested reinforcement in the form of a puck with crew, not knowing when we could expect the arrival of this direly needed weapon. Ahead of us, and to our left, was Feuerstein's squad, which held a commanding view of the battle area and the stream ahead. Suddenly, a machine gun fired from Feuerstein's position. A Russian company had been observed moving along the stream, providing infantry support for 2 T-34 tanks. When taken under fire, the Soviets fled behind the protection of the tanks, one of which immediately halted and pivoted its massive turret toward the hidden MG nest. A direct hit from the heavy guns struck the machine gun position, instantly killing Feuerstein, who had faithfully served under my command for many months. Additional tanks immediately opened fire from the tree line opposite us. Standing with Yuckel and Sepp in a shallow trench, we observed through binoculars when a tank round struck a nearby tree to our left, sending it crashing to the ground. Yuckel slowly turned his head toward me, and I saw that only a small stump remained of the pipe between his lips. A shell splinter had cleared the rim of his helmet and cut cleanly through the head of the pipe. He muttered softly, "That one got me," and sank to the ground. His left upper arm was red with blood soaking through his white camouflage smock. I unbuttoned his blouse and tunic to see that a large shell fragment had nearly amputated his left arm just below the shoulder. Taking a mess tin strap, I bound his arm tightly just below the armpit until the flow of blood ceased. Throughout the incident, Yuckel had not made a sound. Now he smiled faintly and remarked that it appeared he had finally received his long-awaited Haimachus. I helped him to his feet, and he disappeared towards the rear, steadily marching upright without assistance. Some weeks later, I received a letter from a hospital in Vienna, which opened with the words, "My dear Lieutenant." Yuckel wrote that with the exception of his left arm, he remained in one piece. He also added that he lacked tobacco for his pipe, as the hospital did not consider tobacco a priority item for their beleaguered supply system. I underlined this passage in red and passed it to the regimental supply officer Hertel, with a request that some tobacco be sent to him. To my immense satisfaction, I received another letter approximately 4 weeks later, thanking me for fulfilling his request. I shouted for the men to follow, and Schorsch stormed into the trench system, securing our left flank. His machine gunner fired bursts from the hip with his MG-42. Sepp, Humpert and the others followed me into the defence network. From our position, we observed a group of Russians to our right, springing from the ground and dashing through our fire along the perimeter of the earthwork system to a tank squatting ominously in the darkness farther to the rear, its silhouette visible against flashes of our bursting artillery shells. Within a few minutes, the Russians had been pushed from the trenches, and a number of them sought shelter in a depression. As we regrouped and prepared for a counterattack, Sepp Sturm collected a handful of grenades. Running toward the perimeter, he pulled the lanyards and tossed the grenades one after another into the depression. The Russians left a number of dead and wounded behind them, and we took 12 prisoners. Following this attack by our small group, the Russians lost the initiative for assaulting the position. Throughout the following days, they displayed no further inclination to attack. I immediately recommended Sepp Sturm for the Iron Cross, which was presented to him the following morning by the regimental commander. On the 14th of November, the 132nd Infantry Division was relieved in their sector of the Kusinka front by units of the 96th Infantry Division and the 12th Luftwaffe Field Division. We were then transported by rail to Army Group Loch to reinforce the front west of Nevel, near Pustoschka. At this location, the division was not immediately sent into action as a unit, but served as an assault reserve for the defence and reinforcement of the threatened divisions. With the exception of the units remaining in the area of Isakovo, all battalions were used for defence and attack by the 81st and 329th Infantry Divisions. It was planned that the 132nd Infantry Division would attack toward the west from positions south of Nevedro Lake, in support of the offensive launched by the 16th Army at the end of November. This offensive was aimed at encircling Soviet units that had broken through south of Pustoshka. The attack, intended to free the vital supply route to Sheglovo-Lopatovo, was launched on the 29th of November using Grenadier Regiment 436 and units of Police Regiments 16 and 9. Despite overwhelming enemy strength, the units advanced toward their objectives of Vasilyeva, Pustki, and height 192.7. However, due to the heavy losses suffered during previous months, and with no replacements, the assault ground to a halt. A second attack was planned for the 10th of December, after the completion of another supply route reaching the areas of Idritsa, Nishtcha train station, Lushi, and Lopatovo. The division planned to use Grenadier Regiments 436 and 174 for the renewed attack. However, these plans were never carried through, as the division was redesignated Battle Group Wagner. Combined with the 3rd Estonian SS Volunteer Brigade and the Latvian Police Regiment Riga, it was assigned to reinforce the sector between Drissa and Yasno Lake. It was expected that an enemy offensive from the Nevel area would fall on this sector and strike in the direction of Polotsk. This expected attack threatened the entire right wing of Army Group North. The new division sector, which extended over 50 kilometres, remained quiet, with the exception of minor reconnaissance actions, until mid-January. Throughout these weeks, the units remained at work reinforcing and building defences, roads and bridges. The rear echelons were evacuated of all civilians following an increase in partisan activity throughout the dense forests prominent in northern Russia. On the 12th of January 1944, the enemy launched their expected attack. Throughout the early days of the new year, enemy activity had been observed in the areas of Neshcherdo Lake, Yasno Lake, and Nevedro Lake. The Soviets attacked in a northwest direction with the goal of freeing Idritsa, located in the northern area of the division sector. The enemy quickly gained ground against weakly held positions defended by foreign units and police detachments, penetrating toward Pustoya, Mogilino Lake, and Sviblo Lake. The Latvian Police Regiment Riga, operating farther south between Yasno Lake and Gusino Lake, was able to establish a blocking line along Pucharitsa-Ispishcha Sagatya Shkulyatino Diatli. By the evening of the 12th of January, the Soviet advance was halted, and the police regiment reinforced their positions through equipment and command and control assistance provided by the 132nd Infantry Division. On the 14th of January, the division received orders from the 16th Army to engage enemy forces that had broken through along the line on the southern edge of Dubrovo to Aleandrovo. This attack was launched at 2000 hours and succeeded in containing the enemy forces. However, on the 15th of January at 0630 hours, the enemy struck back with a force of 8 to 9 battalions against our weakly held sector, now defended by 3 understrength companies. The enemy, heavily supported by aircraft, artillery, and multiple rocket launchers, attacked the line at Pucharitsa, Ispishcha, Sagatya, Shulyatino, and Podberesia. Local breakthroughs at Pucharitsa, Sagatya, and Shulyatino were contained by a counterattack. Heavy fighting ensued north of Tshaiki and Lushi, following close combat and direct fire support from field artillery. On the 16th of January, repeated attacks against Diatli and positions to the northeast were successfully repelled. The 120 grenadiers manning the defences at Diatli were ordered to counterattack at 1800 hours. The counterattack pushed the enemy back and sealed the salient to the west of Sagatya. On the 19th of January 1944, the division handed over the sector to the newly arrived 290th Infantry Division. January-February 1944, near Diatli. The thermometer read 20 degrees below zero. The Soviets had again broken through the thinly held German lines. Weakened security battalions, many made up of foreign units, were forced to surrender their positions under heavy pressure from the strong enemy forces. I moved forward with my men along a well-worn roadway in the winter night. The Lancers instinctively moved with rifles at the ready. Their dirty white battle smocks gleamed faintly in the darkness as the column made its way forward. We had 3 pony sleds heavily loaded with weapons and equipment. It was a night of total darkness, and although our eyes were accustomed to the night, each man could barely discern the soldier several paces ahead of him. I carefully followed the planned route, occasionally consulting a crumpled map in the dim glow of a field light hidden beneath a shelter quarter. After several hours of marching, we arrived at the headquarters of a foreign security battalion. For the next hour, confusion reigned as we tried to gather information about the area. After several frustrating attempts at communication, we located a German officer, but he could provide little definitive information about the situation or the lay of the front. Once again, I had to rely on my instincts. We set out on a narrow trail leading southeast. Earlier, the regimental commander had instructed me to establish a new defensive line on a small terrain feature. Our destination was a small elevation noted on the map as the village of Diatli. As we approached the area, we suddenly came under fire from submachine guns and machine guns on our left. We returned fire, and the enemy guns fell silent. Through my field glasses, I searched for the huts and buildings that would indicate the village's location. As the dawn broke, I realized we had bypassed the village in the darkness. The remains of Diatli, now barely visible, consisted only of several blackened chimneys standing among the ruins of burned cottages. A low fence and a well appeared through my binoculars, marking the remnants of a former dwelling covered by a thin blanket of snow. Quickly issuing commands, I ordered Feldwebel Staffen to take his platoon to the right flank. Feldwebel Bernhardt remained at our current position. We established machine gun positions among the ruins as isolated rifle shots began to break out in the growing light. The village sat on a commanding height that descended in a gentle slope on all sides. Staffen's platoon, located a kilometre away on another terrain feature, unknowingly lost their commander to a Soviet sniper hidden in the forest. Later in the morning, a German Hauptmann, identified by the red-piped artillery tabs on his collar, approached. He was a forward observer for a battery stationed 2 kilometres to our rear and assured us of artillery support. We prepared for the inevitable Russian attack. The day passed quietly as we dug a banya deep in the earth for shelter. As night fell and the temperature dropped further, I rotated the sentry duties frequently, knowing that alert sentries were essential in the biting cold. Lighting fires was strictly forbidden, as it would immediately draw enemy fire. Just before midnight, we heard commands and shouts from the Russian positions, followed by the ominous sound of boots crunching through the snow. We held our fire until the enemy was visible, and then the MG-42 beside me opened up with a ripping burst. Flares illuminated the battlefield, and artillery shells rained down with devastating accuracy. Though the enemy was repelled, my friend and squad leader, Herfelder, was mortally wounded. The next day, more attacks followed, all repulsed. By the third day, we still held our battered positions, despite repeated assaults. With only 40 men, I was responsible for holding a kilometre-long front. The right flank of our neighbouring position had a 500-metre gap, supposedly manned at night by reconnaissance units. During the night of 17th of January, the Russians launched another attack. Under cover of darkness, they encircled the village and struck our left flank. Grenade explosions and muzzle flashes lit up the night. Sepp Sturm, a survivor from the left wing, returned to us with a grazing wound and equipment riddled with bullet holes. The Russians had overrun our left flank, but Sepp had managed to escape unnoticed after taking cover in a depression. Later that night, as I stood in a chest-high trench, I noticed a light signal flashing intermittently behind a burned-out tank. I prepared to send a team to investigate when I saw the silhouettes of 20 or 30 figures moving toward the light. I opened fire immediately, and the alarm spread throughout our position. Our machine guns were quickly repositioned, and the battle raged on. All our machine guns were positioned on their lafettes, facing the front, and could not immediately be brought to bear on the infiltrators. We took them under fire with small arms and hand grenades. I was vaguely aware of the glowing fuse of a Russian grenade as it flew past me from the darkness. I was then enveloped in a soft, sinking sensation, and knew nothing else. As I slowly regained consciousness, I felt lightheaded and disoriented. My legs radiated pain, and I felt paralyzed, unable to move any part of my body. Slowly, I realized my battle smock was pulled over my head, and as I began to regain movement, I felt pain engulfing every limb. I was shivering with cold, and the ringing in my ears ceased as I pulled my heavy jacket from my face. After several seconds, I could discern the comforting forms of Sepp and Yuckel bending over me, their familiar eyes peering from under the whitewashed Wehrmacht helmets. They had dragged me out of the direct line of fire during the heat of the assault, saving me from the Russians charging through the snow. The Russians had ravaged the Banya with Molotov cocktails. The strong point on our left had been overrun, and in our sector only 10 of us remained. At dawn, reinforcements arrived, a Feldwebel with 25 men from a Silesian division. With them we reoccupied the right flank of the village. The Russians held a small ravine about 100 meters away, offering them cover from our artillery. At dusk we attacked. We overran their position without artillery support, and with Sepp and Yuckel, I closed in on a depression where a Russian had fled with an anti-tank weapon. In the growing twilight, I spotted him just as he squeezed the trigger. The projectile roared past, burning my battle smock and tunic between my arm and hip. I struck him squarely in the chest with my assault rifle. He tumbled backward as Yuckel sprang forward, thrusting his submachine gun muzzle into the Russian's face. The terrified man stared at us, wide-eyed and motionless. Yuckel pulled him up and instructed a radio man to take him to the rear. The Russians quickly counterattacked, storming out of the darkness, throwing grenades. The Feldwebel, who had fought valiantly, was struck in the abdomen by a bullet, spinning him before he collapsed. Again we beat back the attack and recaptured the village of Diatli. At daylight, we risked sniper fire to examine the battlefield. We discovered a knocked-out tank used by a partisan or infiltrator as an orienteering point, likely guiding attackers through our lines. The signal light's discovery had saved us from annihilation. In another incident, a man in German officer's insignia, armed only with a pistol, appeared suddenly in our midst. His presence aroused suspicion, and when I challenged him, he wheeled around and fired 2 shots at me before disappearing into the darkness. It became clear that infiltrators were wearing captured uniforms, and there were rumors that Soviet units were led by Germans who spoke flawless German. Our sentries had occasionally heard cries for help, seemingly from comrades, only to discover these were ploys to lure them to their deaths. In February, I assumed command of the sector northwest of Diatli, with a reinforced infantry pioneer platoon and an alarm company. We suffered heavy casualties, as the Russians had dug in along a trench system within 150 meters of us. Constant sniper and machine gun fire harassed us, and mortar fire was ineffective in dislodging the enemy. Eventually, I positioned a heavy machine gun and pack on the line, targeting where I had seen a sniper's muzzle flash. At dusk, under fire again, we responded with belt after belt of ammunition and high-explosive shells into the Soviet line. Within a week, our sector became the quietest in the regiment. Enemy snipers and machine gun crews only engaged us during the night, retreating at dawn. For several weeks we suffered no further casualties. In mid-February, a machine gunner reported seeing a large dog near our position. I asked if it had a harness or pack, but due to poor light he couldn't be sure. I ordered all such animals to be shot, recalling how the Russians had used dogs with explosives strapped to them to destroy our tanks. The next morning I found dog-like tracks, and later that evening one of the animals was shot between our lines. The following day I saw another large animal near the enemy line and opened fire, killing it. Despite enemy fire, we recovered the body. It was a wolf, feasting on the corpses between the Russian and German positions. The animal was of heavy build, with a pointed muzzle and powerful jaws. The ears were short and round. Its thick winter fur was a grey-beige colour along the flanks, fading to light brown on the underside, and almost dark brown along the back. Sepp skinned the wolf, nailing the pelt to the side of our shelter with wire staples to dry after treating it with salt and birch ashes. After several days, it was pronounced cured, despite a slightly pungent odour. Gefreiter Doser bundled it together and carried it back to Germany on furlough. Within a week, it was being professionally prepared by Weisgerber in Stuttgart, and it remained one of the few souvenirs I retained from the entire experience on the Eastern Front. From 11 to the 12th of March, the division, as well as additional regiments provided by the 120th Infantry Division, remained engaged in heavy combat near Schwari. From 13 to the 19th of March, units of the division were placed under the 32nd and 83rd Infantry Divisions. The fighting at Rog remained fierce and brutal, with every metre of ground desperately defended by the beleaguered Lancers. From the 29th of March to the 4th of April, the division remained in defensive fighting along Neszczerdo Lake and near Lubowo. The Red Army was unsuccessful in repeated attempts to penetrate the German defences, despite overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery and aircraft. The snow and ice slowly receded. On Easter 1944, a Russian company attacked over the frozen Neszczerdo Lake, but was repulsed, leaving the ice strewn with dead. Prisoners who were taken reported that the Soviets believed the West Bank to be poorly defended, and some of them attempted to convince us that the lake was no longer passable due to the recent thawing temperatures. We were fully aware that the lake remained frozen with ice 1½ meters thick, and that it would probably remain passable at least until the end of April or early May. On Easter morning, after I departed the headquarters following a situation briefing, the members of the company presented me with an Easter basket carefully constructed from available materials. Lying on a layer of soft moss were a dozen round, olive-coloured Russian hand grenades, recovered from the bodies of the attackers and carefully arranged within the basket. Thus we celebrated Easter 1944. A heavy machine gun crew with Infantry Regiment 437 was in action during the fighting in the forest north of Smerdenia, February 1943. A heavy Russian tank was destroyed before the positions of Infantry Regiment 437 during the battle for Smerdenia. Notably, enemy dead were found in the immediate vicinity of the armoured vehicle. The Soviet practice of infantry riding on the chassis of tanks into battle could prove devastating if the armoured vehicle was struck by a heavy-caliber pack projectile. Lancers advanced toward the line on a corduroy trail laid through the marshes of the Volchov front in early 1943. A log road led to the forward positions on the Volchov front during the same period, and motor vehicle tyre rims were adapted for use on carts and wagons as an improvised rail system. Lieutenant Biedermann, inspecting defensive positions in the forests of the Volchov front in February 1943, was captured in a photograph receiving a resupply of ammunition south of Leningrad, just hours before a Soviet breakthrough attempt. The heavy log bunkers constructed in the marshy terrain provided effective protection from light mortar and small arms fire. Soviet armour was destroyed during the winter battles near Klosterdorf, March 1943. The thick forests and impenetrable swamps made large-scale assaults by armoured units difficult, forcing them to traverse known trails and roadways. Biedermann, along with Hauptmann Dedel, provided instruction for Luftwaffe replacements in the use of infantry weapons. Despite having received only cursory training close to the front lines, Luftwaffe replacements quickly adapted to the brutal conditions of combat in the frozen forests. Lieutenant Biedermann led a company of Lancers from Infantry Regiment 437 through Szapki, south of MGA, in July 1943. The terrain limited large movements of supplies to corduroy roads, constructed only through the intensive labour of the pioneer units. Russian prisoners were captured during a breakthrough attempt in the Maluksa sector in July 1943. During this Soviet assault, 4 Russian officers and numerous enlisted men were killed before the German positions. In a staff meeting near Szapki in June 1943, participants included Oberst Altmann, commander of IR 438, killed in action in August 1943, General Lindemann, division commander, mortally wounded in Berlin by Gestapo officials in September 1944, Oberst Kindsmiller, commander of IR 437, killed in action in August 1943, and Major Schmidt, commander of the 3rd Battalion, IR 437. Unteroffizier Stenich was photographed at the entrance to the communications bunker in MGA, south of Lake Ladoga near Leningrad, in August 1943. Stenich was later killed in action on the 18th of January 1944 near Diatli. The burial of Oberst Kindsmiller, who was killed by friendly fire on the 17th of August 1943, took place at the military cemetery at Sogolubovka. The Volchov railway bridge, located south of Leningrad, served as a strategically important link on the main railway route from Moscow to Leningrad. Trees and branches were placed on the bridge to conceal troop movement from Soviet ground reconnaissance units. On furlough in Stuttgart, September 1943, Uncle Christian, seated at the centre, died a year later during an American bombing raid. Lieutenant Biedermann, with soldiers assigned as Assault Reserve, Infantry Regiment 437, west of the Neville sector. A 50 mm Pak crew in forward positions near Diatli, mid-January 1944, had just received warm coffee after several days of bitter combat. Feldwebel Bernhardt briefs Lieutenant Biedermann on the strength of Russian positions after returning from a reconnaissance patrol in March 1944. After 1936, even the lesson plans for the teaching of a fighting withdrawal were stricken from the curriculum. Attack and halt were the only two methods of warfare hammered into us. In this regard, the Wehrmacht had entered into the war unprepared. The collapse of Army Group Centre in June and July resulted in chaos. This was clearly exhibited by the countless units observed on the roads and bridges, fleeing to the rear, seemingly leaderless and without direction, while other weakened units attempted to make their way through the mob toward the front to engage the onrushing enemy. Some battered units were overcome with panic, and they streamed toward the west on foot and in vehicles of every description. The confusion, the panic-stricken lancers, and the jamming of all movements along the passable roads would earlier have been considered an inconceivable scenario, but the collapse of discipline and order had become reality. The Russians were able to increase the turmoil and confusion through constant attacks with their air force, which bombed and strafed all roadways and rail lines, leaving shattered, demoralized fragments of once proud regiments strewn in their path. The strategic reserves were unable to make their way through the chaos to the front and remained jammed in the tangle of vehicles and men. The movement of entire units had become impossible. The highest commander, to whom credit for the catastrophe should be awarded, was not present to witness what his decisions had wrought. As always, the soldiers in the field bore the brunt of these mistakes and paid with their lives. Army Group North was impacted by the collapse of the Central Front, as was the XXX Army Corps to the south. At the end of June, the enemy right wing broke out of the heights before Polotsk. The 132 Days Infantry Division was holding a wide sector of the front before Yukhnovo-Moskatchevo and the Velikaya sector. During the night of 28 to the 29th of June, a police security regiment moved forward to relieve the battered lancers holding the positions of the 1st Battalion, Grenadier Regiment 437. With 60 men remaining in the 2nd Company, we crawled from our defences in the swampy ground that we had held for weeks against overwhelming numbers of the enemy opposite us. We marched past the destroyed tank from the winter battle, its sides now streaked with rust, and the hatches frozen open like gaping wounds. We slowly wound our way along the splintered and scarred corduroy road through the swamp. Mess tins, entrenching tools, and assorted equipment rang softly on the steel helmets hanging from our belts, and the Ivans sent departing shots after us. 5 kilometres behind the front, the battalion mustered at the edge of a small wood that offered a semblance of concealment from the ever-present aircraft. Our company spy-ess, Novotny, supplied us with warm food and other small items that we had been unable to receive during the weeks we had been on the line. We spent several hours sitting along the edge of the road, or lying beneath the ragged pine trees, relishing the first warming rays of the early morning sunshine. It was a luxury once again to be able to stand erect without danger, once again to enjoy freedom of movement without the fear of meeting a sniper's bullet. The obligatory schnapps bottle made its rounds. The younger and less experienced Lansers, recent arrivals to the weakened company, rejected offhand the burning, home-brewed drink that left us with an unaccustomed tingling in the throat. We owed this rare amenity to the talents of Feldwebel Röhrer, who had skillfully fashioned a distillery from a battered Russian field kitchen that we had captured during the Crimean campaign. The stove had been modified for our use with a complicated tangle of copper tubing and bits of rubber fuel lines, and had been fed a diet of potatoes and rhubarb gleaned from abandoned villages or captured from partisan caches. As we passed the bottle, we felt an instinctive bond that only the survivors could know. Together we had known wind and heat, life and death. We had experienced hails of bombs and shells. We had tended our wounded, buried our dead, and moved forward to the next encounter, knowing that eventually we would meet the end of our journey. Most of us owed our lives to the skill and self-sacrifice of others in our company, many of whom were no longer with us. We, the survivors, lay on the Russian soil, the smell and touch of which had become so familiar, and dozed in the summer sun. As we lay quietly in small groups, consuming the schnapps and immersed in discussion of those things not associated with war, our idyll was interrupted by the rhythmic sound of approaching horses. Sitting upright, I observed a recent arrival to the division, Oberstleutnant Katzmann, approaching with several members of the regimental staff. He reined his horse to a halt several meters from my position. Rising stiffly to my feet, I drew myself to attention and rendered a salute, greeting him as respectfully as possible under the given circumstances. "Good afternoon, Herr Oberstleutnant," I called, holding my salute. He glared at me momentarily from his position on horseback, before sharply returning the salute. "Lieutenant Biedermann, you are drunk," he stated loudly and emphatically. "Yes, Herr Oberstleutnant," I replied. "I am drunk." As I remained standing, perhaps unsteadily at attention, the staff officer began to upbraid me for my condition. After several long seconds of a stern tirade, I noticed Feldwebel Pinnow rise to his feet and approach our location. With a long, glowing cigar hanging from one corner of his mouth, he marched forward. "What is going on here?" he abruptly demanded, his normally clear and precise demeanour obviously affected by the abundant quantity of schnapps consumed by the roadside. "No one talks to our lieutenant like this." He suddenly brushed past me and approached the mounted Oberstleutnant, exclaiming, "We don't let anyone treat our lieutenant like a recruit." I desperately moved forward in an attempt to grasp him by the shoulder to stop his verbal assault, and Katzmann sat upright in the saddle with indignation, alternately shifting his glare from me to the oncoming Feldwebel. Before I could stop him, and before Katzmann could utter a sharply worded reply, Pinnow had grasped the reins of the mount's halter. Quickly leaning over as if to speak softly to the horse, he pulled the large animal toward him as he held tightly to the halter. Suddenly the lit cigar touched the sensitive muzzle of Katzmann's mount, and the horse exploded into action. Rearing sharply and flailing wildly with iron-shod forefeet, the horse tore itself loose from Pinnow's grasp and rose into the air. Taken completely by surprise, the Oberstleutnant tumbled backward from the saddle, landing in the sandy soil so common to all Russian roadsides. A lancer dashed forward and seized the panic-stricken animal by the reins. Others moved to assist the officer to his feet. Brushing aside their offers of assistance, Katzmann struggled to his feet and recovered his frightened horse. Glaring at me for several seconds, he turned and regained his mount before abruptly turning and riding past our now silent, horrified ranks, followed by his escort. The remaining portions of schnapps were collected by the Gefreiters to be traded for candy and cigarettes. A sizable amount of forbidden firewater made its way to Favoli, Eigner, Binau, and the various company commanders, where it was consumed in quantity. So generous were some of our company members in distributing the surplus that eventually the source of this breach of regulations was traced, and I received a verbal reprimand from the regimental commander. I did not hear another word concerning the roadside incident, although I waited with dreadful expectation to be summoned for disciplinary action. It is likely that Oberstleutnant Katzmann, though short-tempered and often tactless in his resolution of certain situations, was fully aware that to make an issue of the incident would have served no positive purpose under the given circumstances. The company commanders were called to battalion headquarters to be briefed on our current situation by Hauptmann Schmalfeld, the battalion commander. He solemnly advised us that farther to the south, the enemy had broken through our front, and we were assigned to protect the open flank of Army Group North from the massive Russian forces pouring past us toward the west. The battalion was hurriedly loaded into transports, and we were driven south over roads choking with dust. By late afternoon, we had already relocated south of Duna. Following a short pause to organize the battalion, we advanced toward the south before dismounting from the vehicles. The Lancers prepared for action, securing chin straps to their steel helmets, checking canteens of water, ensuring that magazines were fully loaded, and that weapons were functioning faultlessly once again. Canvas sacks of hand grenades were distributed, and the infantrymen shared the burden of reserve machine gun ammunition. Suddenly, a Quebelwagen sped by our position, and from the front passenger seat of the vehicle, Oberstleutnant Katzmann called above the clatter of the Volkswagen's air-cooled engine, "Lieutenant Biedermann, now show us what you can do." I brought my hand to the rim of my helmet in acknowledgement as he disappeared in a cloud of dust. We struck south without artillery support, penetrated the blocking fire of a Soviet howitzer battery, and shortly thereafter came under a concentrated mortar barrage, but miraculously we suffered no casualties. I led the company forward at a run, and as we cleared a small rise, we suddenly found ourselves on a road occupied by Russian engineers, busily engaged in laying box mines in the evening twilight. The Russians scrambled for cover while opening fire with submachine guns in an attempt to protect themselves, but the detachment was raked by a machine gun burst Agnia fired from the hip. The enemy attempted to scatter, and we took 2 pony carts and a truck under fire with our small arms and hand grenades. Within seconds the incident was over, and the guns had fallen silent. We immediately began searching the corpses strewn in the road, and in the passenger seat of the bullet-riddled truck, I found a dying Russian colonel. I searched for and quickly located his blood-spattered map-case in the last light of the sunset, and along with bars of sweet-smelling soap and papyrossi cigarette packages, I uncovered the documents and maps. Stuffing the contents back into the leather case, I slung it over my shoulder and rallied the Lancers, who were engaged in searching the pony carts for additional material. Of more importance to the hungry grenadiers for the moment, they had discovered several pasteboard boxes marked in English in black stenciled letters, and they enthusiastically stuffed their pockets and bread bags with the tinned meat found in the containers. The intelligence officer of the division later confirmed that the documents found on the fatally wounded colonel had revealed the detailed battle plans for the Third White Russian Front, and from the maps the main points of penetration against our defences could be determined. The documents also outlined a new system of attack to be implemented against us. The attacks would be opened by a heavy artillery barrage, followed closely by low-angle blocking fire on the flanks of a corridor. Following closely within the 2 walls of bursting shells, in an area often no greater than 100 metres wide, tanks and infantry would advance. The enemy was again adopting our tactics. We deprived the enemy of the use of the road for the remainder of the night, and the next morning we again moved toward the south and arrived at the location of an abandoned Soviet howitzer battery position. Dozens of spent shells lay scattered among piles of empty and discarded tins marked Oscar Mayer, Chicago. Our sister battalion was simultaneously fighting toward the south. Through the barrages from this Russian battery, they had sustained heavy losses. The battalion commander, Major Schnepf, his adjutant, Lieutenant von der Stein, and many others had fallen. With this attacking movement, we had thrust ourselves 30 kilometres within the open flank of the Russian army, whose units in this area were targeted directly toward part of our homeland, the Baltic Sea and East Prussia. "Onward to Berlin," was the watchword of the Soviets. "Father Stalin has commanded, and the Patriotic Front storms westward to destroy the hated German invaders. To the west must you attack, to avenge your fatherland, the land of the workers and farmers. The women of the enemy will be yours. There flows water from the walls, and you can wash yourselves and drink from porcelain containers." Instinctively, we sensed the disaster that lay ahead, but even the most sceptical among us could never imagine the fury that our opponents from the east would deliver upon our homeland. The regiment holding positions to the south had been bypassed and was threatened with encirclement. During the night of the 30th of June, the 1st of July, we received orders to march in a southerly direction toward Meoria. The battalion was divided into two groups. With 2 rifle companies, an alarm company, 2 self-propelled flak guns, and a heavy anti-tank gun, I was assigned as a group leader under the command of Battle Group Ambrosius. Oberst Ambrosius had recently been the commander of the NCO school in Riga, and one recent afternoon he had simply been pulled from there with his staff and students and thrown into battle. This front, like so many others we had experienced, could be only thinly defended, and even then defence was limited to specific strategically important sectors. Our battle group was assigned to defend a sector approximately 2 kilometres in length. I positioned the anti-tank gun and the 20 mm flak guns on our left flank to cover the road that led through our positions to the southeast. The remaining area had to be defended by the rifle companies. 4 heavy machine guns and 2 80 mm mortars reinforced the right wing. With the rising sun, the Russians probed our positions in company strength. In the early afternoon, heavy artillery rounds began to fall in our sector, and we soon found ourselves under a torrent of shells that abated only when the enemy attempted to penetrate our positions again. We clung to our line through the 4th of July, when the Russians plunged through the positions south of our right flank. The 1st Company, holding our southern sector, was compelled to counterattack in an attempt to close the penetration, and the company commander was among those killed in this action. At 1400, our radio fell silent. We were no longer able to establish contact with Oberst Ambrosius and his staff of academy instructors in Meoria. A reconnaissance platoon from my old company was dispatched in the direction of our right flank in an attempt to contact them, and they returned only to report that they had observed the town to be occupied by Russians. Our battle group continued to hold its positions, despite the repeated Russian attempts to break through the left sector with infantry reinforced with armour. In the evening twilight, as the lancers lay behind their weapons, I crouched together with the radio operator who, bent over his communications equipment, vainly attempted to establish contact on the old frequency. "Mina, please come in. Mina, please report." As darkness settled over us, I received instructions, relayed through the forward observers of a 150 mm artillery unit, to pull back 5 kilometres north-northwest. We feverishly organised for the withdrawal, and under the cover of night we abandoned our positions. Leading the way was one of our self-propelled flaks, the chassis piled high with members of the rifle company. The remainder of the rifle company followed with the anti-tank gun, the additional flak, and, bringing up the rear, the other 2 companies. I joined the rear guard with 2 groups from the 2nd Company. The concise orders had demanded that we withdraw at exactly 2,000, without leaving a rear guard in the positions. Prior to our movement, more fire was exchanged, with infantry weapons and the 2 heavy machine guns firing tracers into the darkness. As we departed, the Russian mortar platoons fired sporadic salvos that impacted behind us. They received no reply. We followed a trail through a thickly wooded area that eventually turned north. Just prior to 2200, we arrived at the eastern outskirts of a burning village. The forward element came to a halt, and I hurried forward. After assessing the situation, we realized that we were now encircled, and that we had no time to lose if we were to survive. From our location, we could observe the village swarming with Russians, silhouetted against the fires that illuminated the area in a ghastly light. Near the edge of the forest, about 100 metres from the first burning house, I stood next to the gunner of the 20 mm. Einar had rested his machine gun across the fender of the vehicle and was prepared to fire. The remainder of our group remained behind us, hidden in the shadows of the forest. After a moment's hesitation, we moved forward and passed the village to the east, the flames from burning huts sending ghostly shadows among the trees. Despite the grinding of the engine that powered the self-propelled flak, we remained unnoticed as we left the Russians behind us and eventually arrived at a forest-covered swamp. In the dim glow of a field lamp, I could see that my map outlined the northern edge of the swamp, beyond which was only a blank quadrant, void of the information we now required. Nevertheless, I realized that even this poorly executed map exhibited more information than many of our units would have had of the area. We proceeded through the forest until we entered a small clearing in the canopy of thick trees. From a small rise, I looked toward the north and northwest, and at approximately 10 kilometers distance, it was possible to observe a number of flares hanging silently in the sky. Russian aircraft had released them in preparation for a bombing run. There were the front lines. That must be our target as well. I advised the men of our objective, and we moved on through the darkness. A summer fresh sunrise brought a new day, the 5th of July 1944. The first morning rays danced on the meadows and wheat fields of a softly undulating landscape as we departed the perimeter of the forest. Barely 100 meters distant, a hill came into view, on which was perched a primitive wooden shed. I cautiously approached the structure with the point element, intending to brief my second-in-command on our next movement. Barely 30 meters from us, a tall Russian major suddenly sprang from the waist-high wheat with a drawn pistol and shouted in broken German, "Surrender, Fritz! You're surrounded!" For only a heartbeat, the air remained still, and without warning, a burst from Feldwebel Ushakow's submachine gun soared across the major's breast. The air instantly filled with the roar of gunfire. Russian submachine guns fired on us from almost point-blank range, hand grenades from both sides detonated around us, and we attempted to return fire while lying on the open ground. Still concealed in the forest, barely 100 meters behind us, and yet unseen by the Russians, the first 20 mm flak opened fire, the rounds snapping viciously through the air above our heads. We could clearly see the tiny clouds of grey smoke as they exploded in the field before us. The second 20 mm was soon brought into action, and taken by surprise by this overwhelming firepower that had suddenly surfaced in their midst, approximately 100 Russians fled before us to take cover in a protecting depression. The rifle companies swarmed to the right and left of the road, plunging forward through the green stalks of wheat. With the flak guns and the anti-tank gun in tow rumbling along the road, we pushed frantically toward the north. The seriousness of our situation, made desperate by our short-lived firefight, was apparent to every member of our group. I shouted over my shoulder to the men hurrying behind me, "Whoever wants to surrender can stay here. The rest of us will break through." There was no need to glance back toward our rear to know that no one remained behind as we urgently hurried on. In the early afternoon, we arrived near a settlement situated on a small rise that commanded the area. Dismissing the possibility that the village was occupied by the enemy, I prayed that from this location it was only a few kilometers to the Duna, where our lines would be. The settlement was defended with 2 aging but still formidable T-26 tanks, which, belching clouds of black smoke, manoeuvred to meet us with swinging turrets as we neared. Exhibiting great skill and bravery, Feldwebel Beinau managed to get close enough to destroy one of them with a shaped charge. One of our flak guns received a direct hit in the engine, and I crouched alongside the smoking chassis while the gunner continued hammering with uninterrupted fire at the enemy, a crimson stream of blood running from the sleeve of his tunic. The second Russian tank ground to a halt, and as the crew attempted to abandon the vehicle, they tumbled to the ground under a hail of our small arms fire. We rose from our positions and stormed into the village, screams erupting from our throats as we opened fire and threw hand grenades into the cottages. A machine gunner barely 20 years old received a shoulder wound. Pausing long enough to grab the MG-42, I yelled for him to make his way toward the anti-tank gun so that they could take him aboard the self-propelled vehicle. Firing from the hip, I sprinted ahead with the others, and we broke through to the opposite side of the village. We plunged ahead, leaving the burning dwellings behind us, and we soon arrived at the next settlement. There were no Soviet soldiers to be seen, but the inhabitants had everything prepared to welcome their liberation by the Red Army. We were suddenly among them before they were able to recognize our ragged uniforms and camouflage-bedecked helmets, and they were leaning from the doorways and windows of the huts, cheering and waving bits of white and red cloth. The women had prepared to greet their liberators with bowls of sweet cream, and the excited children stood nearby with wooden spoons. Horrified, they suddenly realized that the heavily armed arrivals were not members of the Red Army, but were the enemy. Exhausted, hungry, and in torn uniforms caked with mud and sweat, we quickly downed the food and drink intended for our antagonists, otherwise ignoring the terrified inhabitants. As the sun descended on the horizon, we made our way closer toward our objective. Suddenly, from our right flank, we received a burst of machine gun fire that snapped harmlessly overhead, and in the distance, along the edge of the road, we could make out the distinctive helmets of a heavy machine gun crew crouching low behind their weapon. Our hearts pounding with elation, we drew cautiously nearer, calling to them in German. As we neared, they gazed at us with wide-eyed astonishment. While attempting the breakthrough back to our lines, the men of the rifle companies had requisitioned or captured pony carts into which the machine guns and wounded were now loaded. Some of the men were marching barefooted, their worn-out boots hanging across the backs of the horses. The uniforms were in tatters, white bandages stained with red-brown standing out starkly as a testament to the battles we had fought. The exhausted group entered the positions of the Oberst, who had been assigned to defend Mioria. Surrounded by officers of his staff, he stood in an immaculate uniform next to a table at a small crossroads. A tent had been erected in the background. On legs, trembling with weariness, I reported the return of my unit. A large map was spread on the table, and I attempted to show him our route of retreat. For 3 days and nights we had been constantly on the move, without a moment's rest, and my eyelids grew heavy as I directed him across the map. Suddenly, and without warning, the colonel began roaring at me in a manner I had not heard since the war school. I became instantly wide awake. As he berated me for my appearance and bearing, I found myself resisting the urge to toss the table and the map at him and the surrounding officers, some of whom were glaring at me grimly. Others appeared to suffer embarrassment at the outburst. He ended the tirade by requesting that I remove my dirty finger from his map and to use a twig of grass if needed for briefing him on our route. I ended the briefing abruptly and wordlessly departed their gracious company as quickly as possible. I returned to the ragged column of lancers standing in the dusty roadway, and we moved on. Despite our immense relief at having returned to our lines, we were overcome with an intense longing to be back with our old regiment, to be again in the company of our family. We were attempting to find the route to our unit when we spotted an artillery carriage with the circular tactical insignia of our division, and we knew in which direction we must march. The following morning, the 6th of July, we occupied a security line in the area of Druya, and in the course of the next several days, we shifted our positions to cover a line 10 kilometers south of Druya-Antonovka-Sosnovka-Malinovka. On the 12th of July, we lay near Krasnogorka on Snudy Lake, before again launching an attack toward the south into the open Russian flank. This attack from 13 to the 19th of July carried us to Strusto Lake and Dundel near Plusy. On the 12th of July, the regiment was situated 50 kilometers southeast of Dunneberg, before a terrain feature that offered an excellent field of fire for our antagonists. I was with the 2nd Company in a depression that could be taken under fire from the nearby Soviet positions. During daylight hours, we could barely show our heads from the muddy holes we had dug without drawing enemy mortar and small arms fire. We repeatedly requested artillery and assault gun support, as without this reinforcement it would be next to impossible to ever silence the guns that terrorized us. We were acutely aware that even to attempt to do so would result in disaster. Oberst Sepp Drexel came to our rescue with Regiment 436. He had been given the assignment to close the gap between our division and our southern neighbour southwest of Plusy. To my immense relief, Uncle Sepp assumed leadership of both regiments, and with 2 assault guns at his disposal, the experienced commander pushed deep into the enemy flank. Following this action, we were able to storm the heights from our low-lying positions, overrun the Soviet positions, and push far to the south in the direction of Strustow Lake. This action afforded the Army Command a temporary and short-lived respite, as a major part of the right wing of Army Group North, which a few days previously had been fighting on the western heights before Polotsk, could be withdrawn to a less threatened area. For his initiative and action taken in stabilizing the situation on the southern wing, Oberst Drexel was awarded the Knight's Cross, which he most highly deserved. On the 29th of July, we moved to Aknista. We maintained our positions for a week, during which time Hauptmann Schmalfeld was killed, and I assumed command of the battalion. We were then ordered south, and the long columns of ragged lancers wound their way to Stockmannshof in the Duna bridgehead. Here we remained, holding a thin line for almost 2 weeks before moving again, back toward the north and crossing the Duna over a wooden pontoon bridge. Following our crossing of the river, we attacked toward the north near Ergli, 20 July 1944. Count Klaus von Stauffenberg placed his bomb in the headquarters of the Führer to destroy the Brown dictator. Repercussions of this assassination attempt, the Attentat on the supreme commander of the German Wehrmacht and the greatest warlord of all time, were felt even on our foremost lines of the Eastern Front. Our decimated companies had been engaged in constant battle since the 30th of June 1944. The opportunity to sleep, to close our eyes and momentarily escape the horror, came by the hour, by the minute, by the second. We remained drained and exhausted. The environment had ravaged the Lancers physically and psychologically. The front demanded that each individual fight to survive from minute to hour. Then, in addition to the adversity and losses we were experiencing, came the news of the assassination attempt. Simple words cannot express the thoughts we held at the news of the attempt on the life of Hitler. For years, we had continued to fight bitterly for the survival of our homes and our families. However, as the rumours of the actual situation in our homeland increased, combined with the exhortations of the political leaders far from the guns, we began to further question the integrity of our leadership in Berlin. We had become painfully aware that our sacrifices, the years of constant exposure to suffering, deprivation, and death, had left these leaders indifferent and emotionless to everything except whatever would benefit and enrich them as individuals. We began seeking and praying for an end to the conflagration into which so many millions had been thrust. A week later, I learned from the forward observers of an artillery regiment that the son of General Lindemann had been arrested by a field police unit. He had been assigned to an artillery regiment of the 132nd Infantry Division, and when the news of the failed attempt on Hitler was announced, he was supposedly overheard saying, "Too bad that he isn't dead." He had then been denounced by one of his own men. It was confirmed that General Lindemann, our former commander, was a member of the resistance group, and it is highly likely that the arrest of his son was the result of the so-called Sippenverhaftung, which was carried out zealously and without mercy by the men of the party. General Lindemann was an officer of the old school, an excellent leader of troops who had the refined mannerisms of an aristocrat. While serving as division commander, he had gone to great lengths to ensure that his troops received the best available care, and he had exhibited the most meticulous professionalism throughout the offences at Feodosia, Kerch, and Sevastopol. He had always ensured that artillery, Luftwaffe, and all additional means of support were arranged and carried out to the utmost degree possible in order to reduce casualties. Several times during the fighting at Gaitolovo, he had risked his reputation and career by insisting that a delay or a rescheduling of an attack be implemented, in the face of much opposition from the higher command, after a careful study of the situation. This may have cost General Lindemann some prestige in Berlin. However, it certainly reduced the number of casualties that might have been incurred while ensuring the same successful results. It was also under his command that the great Soviet offensives at Smerdainia and Lake Ladoga were broken. And now it was revealed to us that General Lindemann was a member of a resistance group. From that moment, all reason for self-sacrifice, for loyalty to the country and to the National Socialist government, all the reasons with which we were constantly imbued for making the sacrifices on the front, would be forever in question. This one act, more than any other factor, revealed to us that the war was lost. The knowledge that a number of our most talented and trusted military leaders would attempt to kill our head of state, albeit a ruthless dictator, proved to us that militarily we could not win against the massed combined might of the Allies. The one remaining factor that steeled us to fight ever harder was the knowledge that our Soviet enemy would show no commitment to civility or to the common laws of humanity should they invade our homeland. The other outcome of the attempt on the Führer's life was that it could not be denied, regardless of the lengths taken in justification, that Hitler, the one-time idol of millions, became, in the eyes of many, nothing more than a dictator in brown who would take any sadistic and brutal measures against his political opponents. Our own commanders in the field, to whom we entrusted our lives and who controlled our destiny, fell among the ranks of his victims as well. In the eyes of the soldiers, the aura of the Führer was destroyed. The explosives placed by Oberst Count von Stauffenberg did not kill the dictator, but the act undermined, if it did not destroy, the idolatry that had been so carefully instilled and nurtured by the government throughout our youth. For some time there had been National Socialist political officers assigned to military units. In the previous months and years, hardly anyone within the ranks on the front had taken them seriously. Initially, they were usually experienced, trusted veterans of the frontline units who, because of serious wounds, were no longer able physically to serve in the lines. Nevertheless, as the fortunes of the war began to turn, it became apparent to us that they increasingly came to resemble their counterparts in the Red Army, and they came to be known among the Lancers as Politruks. Following the 20th of July assassination attempt, the military salute was changed. The traditional salute, universally recognized as bringing the hand to the cap visor or rim of the steel helmet, was now forbidden. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking military officer of our nation, deemed the Nazi Party salute as more appropriate for demonstrating the loyalty of the Wehrmacht to the ruling system. This party salute, the thrusting of an outstretched right arm forward, was observed with contempt and resentment by soldiers who honoured military tradition, and the order was taken as an insult by those who valued high standards and character.